Throughout American history, African Americans have been discriminated against. Even after the abolishment of slavery, black people were still discriminated against. The segregation of black and white people occurred in many fields, including music. This goes back to its roots. This is a documentary short by Bolly Summers
and Ethan Simmons.
The origins of jazz music and the oppression of African Americans can be traced back to the tribes from which slaves were taken. These tribes had strong musical traditions, and these traditions were brought with them to the U.S. Slave owners specifically split up slaves from the same communities in attempt to break these traditions. However, singing in the fields was encouraged in order to keep the slaves happy. Work songs came from this. Most work songs are characterized by a strong underlying pulse created by hand claps or the rhythm created from the blow of heavy implements. Some work songs feature the call and response technique, in which one leader sings a verse and the rest of the group responds with the next. These elements have transferred and can be seen in jazz music even today. From there, black music evolved into blues and ragtime. Blues, ragtime, and jazz were all originally African American-based genres of music. Sadly, commercial success in the early days of these styles came largely from white musicians. The fact of the matter was, there weren't many jobs available to musicians in general, and those that were went to whites. However, marching bands, brothels, and clubs provided jobs to black musicians. In fact, the majority of early ragtime and jazz pianists started their careers in brothels. It is speculated that Jelly Roll Morton, a famous black jazz musician, started this trend by playing piano in his own establishment, just to keep an eye on the business. Jazz originated from black culture and oppression predating the Revolutionary War. In that sense, it's almost cruelly ironic that the first jazz band ever to be recorded was all white. The original Dixieland Jazz Band became famous worldwide in its time. It spread the jazz bug to the north and increased the jazz audience population significantly. It was even they that spread the name jazz. Originally called jazz, the band had to change the word because too many local hooligans thought scratching off the J on their posters would be just hilarious. Additionally, the first published ragtime was composed by a white musician. Let it be remembered that these musicians were not the first to play these styles, but rather that they were the first white musicians, copying styles from African Americans who didn't have the opportunity to be heard by the public.
Hey mama, look around. Everybody's moving to a brand new sound. Hey mama, follow me. I know something's in you that you wanna set free. So let's go with the past now. Say hello to the love in your heart. Yes, I know that the world's spinning fast now. You gotta get yourself a brand new start. Hey mama, welcome to 60s. Oh, mama, welcome to 60s.
The decade of the 1960s in music is often remembered as the decade that the British invaded America. Bands like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, the Animals, and the Kinks were in the public eye. But black musicians during that time made accomplishments that shaped the decade, even if they weren't always in the limelight. During the 1960s, there was a division between black and white music. This division goes back to the invention of jazz and blues. Artists like Muddy Waters did not get as many followers from white audiences. Some black artists, though, got a following from both black and white audiences. Chuck Berry is one example. He avoided incorporating race into his music. As he put it, "I made records for people who would buy them. No color, no ethnic, no political. I don't want that. I never did." The Supremes also got a large following from both black and white audiences. Motown Records produced many top 10 hits by African Americans. This helped popularize artists like Marvin Gaye and the Supremes. The Motown sound, as it was called, brought in many people from all over into Detroit in hopes of them achieving the Motown sound. Although they gained a lot of popularity, black musicians were still not as popular as white musicians, but a lot of elements from African American music were incorporated by British bands. The House of the Rising Sun was written by the Animals while they were on tour with Chuck Berry.
There is a house in New Orleans. They call the rising sun. And it's been the ruin of many a poor boy. And God, I know I'm one. My man was a tailor. Sold my new blue jeans. My father was a gambling man down in New Orleans.
The Beatles borrowed elements from gospel, rhythm and blues, and elements from work songs. This can be heard in songs like Hard Day's Night.
Begin to sing stuff like, it's been a hard day's night, and I've been working.
The Beatles' favorite musicians include the likes of Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Arthur Alexander. The Rolling Stones even borrowed their title from a black musician's song, Muddy Waters' Rollin' Stone. Keith Richards even said, "It's very difficult for me to talk about Chuck Berry, 'cause I lifted every lick he ever played." Even though this music originated in America, when British musicians started playing it, many people thought it was entirely new. Throughout American history, African Americans have been oppressed. The music industry is no exception, but African Americans made great strides in music, even though they received little recognition. From blues to jazz to soul to rock and roll, black musicians built a foundation on which all musicians stand on. Even through prejudice and segregation, black musicians helped define jazz and rock and roll.